So you're ready to shoot an interview. Either you've found a sweet spot to shoot it in, or more likely the business you're shooting for has said, these are our options, and you're working with what you're given. And of course, everybody who's weighing the options for an interview location is paying close attention to how quiet or noisy each location is, right? Because an interview that looks awesome but sounds terrible is worthless. So don't make that mistake. Now, at some point, whether before or after you've found your camera position and placed your interviewee, you'll need to assess the available light. Is there available light? Maybe you're shooting at night in a barn with no electricity, and you'll need to bring in battery or generator-powered lights. Or maybe, like here in my very messy garage, you've got a single light bulb in the ceiling. As a general rule of thumb, you'll want to set your camera's exposure for the background first, then light the interviewee. In most cases, you'll have limited or no control over the available light in a space. And most people don't have the budget, tools, time, or permissions necessary to completely black out a space in order to relight it according to their preferences. So you'll need to tailor your exposure to the available light, or in other words, once again, work with what you're given. So, my very scandalously clad dummy friend Hector is in position here, and I'm bringing my ISO up to 3200. This level of gain or amplification will result in a noisier image than if I were shooting at a lower ISO, but this single overhead bulb isn't pumping out a ton of light. I'll adjust my aperture here to T4 because that gives me my preferred depth of field. And if you just asked yourself, T4, what's that? For now, you can just think of it as F4. Now that we've got our background exposed, we're ready to either redirect the available light or bring in artificial light to properly expose the interviewee. For demonstrational purposes, I've intentionally placed Hector in a position which casts bad-looking and harsh shadows across his face. Ideally, you won't have to deal with these poor of conditions, but I'm giving you a worst-case scenario, so you know how to deal with it. The easiest way to deal with nasty overhead light is to swing in a flag, something to block the light. No more yucky shadows. Before I move on, I've got to define a couple terms because I'll be using them for the remainder of this lesson. A key light is the source of light responsible for the primary exposure of the subject. In terms of shooting an interview, it's the main light on the subject's face. The key light may not literally be a light. It may be an object reflecting another source of light, such as the sun, onto the subject. A fill light is the source of light responsible for pushing light into the shadows on a subject, shadows which were created by the key light. Much like the key light, your fill may not literally be a light. The purpose of a fill light is to control the amount of contrast on the subject, or the ratio between the light and dark side, or how dramatic of a difference there is between the light and dark sides. A rim light, or hair light, or edge light, or kicker, is the source of light illuminating the backside of the subject for the purpose of creating a perceived separation of the subject from the background. And lastly, a practical light, although I'm not demoing one here, is an artificial light left or placed in the frame to add interest to the background. This is usually something like a lamp. Alright, what we're looking at here is typical of what you'll hear referred to as three-point lighting. And it's fairly common for interviews because it does look pretty good. There are many ways to position your three lights, but you should also know that you don't necessarily need all three to achieve a good-looking interview. In fact, you don't need to buy any lights at all, and I'll demo this later when we take Hector outside. Quick note, yes, there is a white t-shirt over my fill light, which is serving no other purpose than to cut the intensity of light from this LED panel, because even on its lowest intensity, it was just too bright at my current exposure settings. Another option may have been to move the light farther away, but I didn't have the space. You may encounter a similar situation at some point. My key light is positioned up and to camera right. The particular position I've placed it in results in what's called Rembrandt lighting, named after the famous painter, and the pattern of light cast on the subject's face gives the face great dimension. The telltale sign of Rembrandt lighting is a half-lit face with a small triangle of light under the eye of the shadow side of the face. Note also that the camera is looking at the shadow side of Hector's face. When your key illuminates the far side, this is referred to as short lighting. You'll see that the shadow side of Hector's face is broader than the light side, hence the name short lighting. Now this is my favorite setup, but it's not appropriate for every situation, so let's see about another look. I'll turn off the fill light so that when I reposition the key, it's easier to see the pattern I'm creating on Hector's face. I'm moving the light pretty much directly in front of Hector, and the bottom of the light is about 1 foot above his eye line. Key light height may vary, but in general, positioning the key at or above a subject's eye line is recommended most of the time, and I'll show you why later. I'll make a note here that with the light in this position, the stand it's on may block the eye line between the interviewer and the interviewee, so you may need to boom the light out from the stand to get the stand out of the way. With the key light centered to the subject, this is referred to as paramount, butterfly, or infinity lighting. I'll add the fill back in, though I may have done well to position the fill light also directly in front of Hector, stemmed down or lower, angled upward to better fill the new direction of shadows cast by my repositioned key. However, this looked good enough for me. But let's say I wanted more contrast for the scene. I want to make that background darker. Note that this option is only available to me in this scenario in which the light illuminating the background is not the same light which is illuminating the subject. To do this, I'll start by bringing my ISO down to 1600, half the amount of gain applied. This results in a darker image overall, and I'll bring the power of the LED panels up to compensate for the light lost on subject. Here's a look at before and after. For those pros out there watching and wondering why my exposure changes aren't looking how you'd expect, I'm being sneaky and changing the contrast curve in post as I make my exposure changes. Alright, let's drop the background exposure by one more stop, or half the amount of exposure. Now, since in low light conditions, this particular camera doesn't look so nice at ISO 800, half of 1600, I'm going to drop my ISO to 400, then open my aperture to t2.8. Effectively lowering my overall exposure by one stop. Let's increase the contrast and see what this looks like with no fill. And let's check out Rembrandt once more at this new exposure. And that's about as dramatic as I'm going to get with Hector for this scene. Since we're here, let's bring some fill back in. And even more. Here's a look at our flavors of paramount lighting. And here's a look at our first Rembrandt setup compared to our final, much more dramatic look. You know, David, you're showing me all these fancy tricks you can do with lights, but you said we don't even need to buy any lights. Can we get to that part? Sure. We're going to work with the best free light available, the sun. It's important to note that when shooting outside, not only is the weather a major factor for working in the outdoors, but time of day and location are important too. One more thing, you're going to want a neutral density, or ND filter. This is like sunglasses for your lens. They come in different strengths. This one is rated at 1.2, which reduces exposure by 5 stops. Now, while it's possible to get a decent exposure without an ND filter, you typically have to stop down or fully minimize the aperture of your lens and shoot at a higher shutter speed, which makes camera motion look unusual. That's weird. Additionally, with our lens fully stopped down, our depth of field increases. But check out the difference with this ND filter on, and boom! Delicious blurry background. Here, Hector is seated outside on a mostly cloudy day. Currently there's cloud cover, which makes for lovely soft light. Problem is, it's still midday, which means the sun is nearly directly overhead and Hector's beautifully manufactured eyes are in shadow. He's got raccoon eyes. Later in the day, the cloud cover is still doing wonders for the quality of light, but now the sun is much lower in the sky, giving us a soft paramount look. Heck, we can even shape the light by turning Hector a little, and oh yeah, we've got some dimension to that face. Shooting while the sun is lower in the sky beats the pants off shooting midday. All the time, every time. But what if we don't have clouds doing the work for us? Working with direct sunlight can be lovely, but if you've ever looked toward the sun, say while someone's taking a photo of you, you start doing this. Which is not a good look for an interview. Although if it's appropriate for the scene, sunglasses and direct sunlight work great together. Another thing to consider is that you may not like or desire the quality of light provided by direct sunlight. Okay, I keep saying things like quality of light, soft light, hard shadows. What does this mean? When describing the quality of light, we're talking about the transition from the light to the dark side of a subject. If the transition is sudden or sharp, like we see here on Hector's face, there's a very distinct shadow line, that's referred to as hard light. When we look at Hector's face while there's cloud cover, the transition from light to dark is very smooth, and this is referred to as soft light. The quality of light is determined by the size of the light source relative to the subject. The sun is massive, but it's so far away that relative to the subject, it's a tiny circle in the sky, and therefore casts hard light. On an overcast day, sunlight is diffused through the clouds, and the entire surface area of the clouds is now your light source, which means that, relative to Hector, the light source is huge, and you get soft light. In the instance that we don't have an overcast sky, we need to make our own clouds. So, we're going to employ any camera person's first light shaping tool, the 5-in-1 reflector. It's got silver, it's got white, and when you unzip it, there's black, a useless gold-silver mix, and the core is a translucent fabric. The core's translucent fabric will do the job the clouds were doing of diffusing the sunlight and increasing the size of the light source relative to the subject, giving us soft light. I'll move it into place here and adjust my exposure to make up for the loss of light on Hector. Besides using the reflector core to change the quality of light, the interviewee can now also look toward the camera without squinting. Nice. We're now shooting with one light, and we didn't even have to buy it. You want to see how you can shoot with two lights, also without having to buy them? Whoa, no, bad. We won't do that. We're going back to our handy-dandy 5-in-1 reflector, and this time we're going to use it as a bounce. We'll turn Hector around so he's backlit by the sun. This effectively makes the sun our rim light. That's light number 1. I'm putting my hand over the lens here because the sun is low enough in the sky that it's shining directly into my lens. Normally I'd shade the lens with a tool called a matte box or otherwise flag it off. Now, this is an okay look, and since Hector is turned away from the sun, there's no hard light on his face. But we can make it even better. Now, I have the luxury of editing and was able to test the light output from both the white and silver sides of my reflector before filming. I got the best results with the silver side, so that's what I'll go with here, but your results may vary. A quick warning that sometimes the silver side is just as excruciating to have pointed at your face as facing the sun directly, so be careful. I'll move the reflector into place. Luckily, it doubles as a flag and shades my lens from the sun. I'll adjust my exposure. Super nice. Now we've got paramount lighting from our bounce, which is acting as our key light, light number 2. See? 2 lights without buying or stealing them. Note that we aren't limited to paramount lighting here. I can move the reflector off to the side for a different look. And there's my hand again as a lens shade. Okay, so besides time of day, weather conditions and location must be given attention. Here's a time lapse which exemplifies not only how temperamental cloud cover can blow your exposure, but also how, and perhaps unwittingly, placing your subject partly in shade, partly in sun will make life difficult. Here's the scene when we arrived. A bit flat and raccoon eyes, but not horrendous until blammo! That darn sunshine peeks through the clouds and blows your boy's head off. Sorry, Hector. Let's talk about supplementing daylight with artificial light. If you want as much control as possible, you'll need to, just like we did earlier in the garage, create a separation between the available light exposing the background and the artificial light exposing the subject. Just like in the garage, I'm going to start by flagging Hector off from the yucky overhead light using that same old 5-in-1 reflector. Do you want one now? Have I sold you on it? Should I have established an affiliate relationship with a reflector manufacturer so I could benefit from your purchase of one I've linked below? Probably. Oh well. Be sure to orient the black side of the reflector down for maximum shade, but you're welcome to try the white or silver side down too, which will give different effects. I've placed the flag a little low here, so I'm going to raise it up to let some of the daylight give us a bit more fill. Since we're located on the shady side of my backyard, the fill provided by the available light won't fluctuate super crazy even when the clouds break and the sun hits the background directly. I like the amount of fill I've got here, but I'm definitely overexposed, so I'll stop down. Now I'm going to bring in a light, again going to my favorite, Rembrandt short light. A little increase in intensity from our key, and we're looking good. Here's a side-by-side of the scene when we arrived compared to how it looks after we've shaped and added light. Since we've isolated the subject from the background, have a look at this new time-lapse and notice that while the background exposure may fluctuate wildly, the exposure on Hector barely changes. This is very usable. I'll move the light now for a paramount look. Nice. And I'll show you my least favorite lighting setup, broad lighting. This just means that your key light is now exposing the camera side of the subject's face. And there's technically nothing wrong with lighting your subject this way, except that you'll look like a chump. It's true. Now here's why most of the time you want to keep your key light above the subject's eye line. Underlighting like this looks unnatural. Plus, if the subject is big on talking with their hands will be constantly casting shadows across their face. However, this may be appropriate for interviewing folks working on a horror movie, for instance, where underlighting is used more often. Here's a look at all 4 light position variations. And finally, you might be wondering how I lit myself. For my key, I've got a round LED panel in front and higher than my eye line. I have the silver side of my reflector just below me, acting as a fill. I have another LED panel rigged overhead with a blue gel on it, firing at a plain white paper backdrop. And lastly, 2 rim lights, one on each side, giving me some sweet edge light. And on either side of me are flags, blocking the light cast from each rim light from striking the lens. Okay, lesson over, and I'll end with this. Lighting is an art, and art is subjective. Societal tastes change, and your art may change with them. There are no right answers in art, but only some will get you hired.